All right, everyone. So we're going to begin, and we're finally moving on from Rebbe Nachman. And so because we spent so long on Rebbe Nachman, I didn't want to straight away go to another rabbi. I thought they needed some space in between going to another rabbi. And so what I wanted to actually do for a few weeks is go back to some of the other rabbis we've seen, and I really enjoyed going in detail into Rebbe Nachman, into some of his teachings, where we really went into the teachings, because we sometimes, I feel, in our modern world we have these caricatures of the Hassidim. They're just these happy people who kind of like dance around and big hats and do their thing, but they had very and the way they look, and they're drinking the schnapps, and all the things they do. But I feel their teachings are very, very deep and very profound, and in some ways, you can't find anything like what some of them wrote in anywhere else in Judaism, in their directness. I mean, the Kabbalah sometimes but even in studying straight up Kabbalah, it's very hard to get to it. And so I wanted to go back to some of the teachings by some of the Rebbes that I find to be particularly powerful and unique. Really, you can't find this anywhere else in Judaism. And actually, this teaching we're going to look at today from Rebbe Yitzchak of Berditchev, it was based on a translation that I found, but the translation I found horrible. And I actually went back and painstakingly retranslated over 50% of it, because I thought the person who was translating didn't know what he was talking. That's not kind, but he was translating in a way which I think was just not true to the original text and to the insight Levi Yitzchak was bringing from, I think, his own experience and he was trying to translate it in a way that was scholarly, but in my mind, not actually understanding what the essence of what Levi Yitzchak was getting to. So I spent a lot of time retranslating it, so the English isn't quite as fluid as it might have been, because once I'd spent all that time, I didn't have time to then go ahead and make it beautiful English. But because it was more important for me to get to what he was saying.
Well, thank you for doing that.
Yeah. Well, I hope you enjoy.
That takes a lot of work and a lot of thought, for sure.
Yeah. May I just ask if that
Sure.
text is in Safari, because I couldn't find it, and I wanted to see what the words were. They have these translations. I thought they might be yours, like normal reality or something like that. That you're getting at something, of course, but I didn't know. Not that I would know, but I could see the Hebrew words. It would be good. So I just wanted. I don't want you to take time in class about this. I'm just saying that.
Well, so it's really interesting. We can talk about it as we go through, because I did it yesterday, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. But like for the world, it's in Safari, both the translation I was working with and the original Hebrew. And so the way Hasidic teachings work is it's by parsha, right? Because it's a lot of these were actually given on Shabbat. There's like they're giving a talk on Shabbat, and either day or one of your students after Shabbat was over went ahead and put it into the computer. I mean, wrote it down, not the computer probably. But he was so the word for normal reality that he was using, the Leviat, was mitziyut, which means kind of like physicality, or it's kind of like existence, back to existence. So as soon as we get to it, and I'll try and go through it in that way. And so if Phil, if you're looking for the original, Levi Yitzchak on Lech Lecha has a long teaching based on a lot of different parts of Lech Lecha.
Yes,
it's about two-thirds of the way down. Yes, about 2/3 of the way down. So a little bit of back.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I couldn't find it there, and I didn't realize I hadn't gone far enough. Thank you.
Exactly. You have to go far. You have to go far into it. And I remember when I originally studied this with my father. It was a long time ago, and I tried to go back and find it. It took me so long to find. And actually, the original teaching that I wanted to find, the translator didn't even translate, because I guess he found it to be too perplexing, or so he didn't even translate. He just put a little note. And I was looking, and I spent half an hour looking for it, And then suddenly I was like, well, I have to pull up English Hebrew, and I pulled up English Hebrew and found that he just had a note for that Hebrew one. He didn't actually translate it, and it's a teaching preceding this one, but this one's more accessible. So I'm glad that I went back and I read what he was doing. Like, that's not how I understand it, and I kind of first translated one bit, and then I was like, the whole thing is crooked. So I went back and retranslated the whole thing. And so, so the way it works is kind of the way I, as a rabbi, approach a parsha when I'm giving a sermon on the parsha, which is, you can give a sermon from the beginning of the parsha, or you can give a sermon on the end of the parsha or the middle of the parsha. And a lot of Hassidic drashas are like the way rabbis are these days, are in the beginning of the parsha, because you start reading the parsha, and like, oh, this is so interesting, and then that's what you pick to speak on Shabbat. This is how rabbis these days work, right? And so it's the same back then. The Hasidim would read the beginning of the parsha and find it interesting, and that's what they would talk on. But this is not the beginning of the parsha, though we sometimes thread back into it. Thank you. This is from a later part of Parsha Lech Lecha, which is one of the greatest parshiyot. This is all the life of Abraham, and it begins when God tells to him, leave your home and go to the land of Israel. And then the whole parsha is about Abraham's journey, right, of growing and becoming, going from being Abram to being Abraham, right? At a certain point, his name gets changed by God, and so he's kind of like going through this whole journey. And this is before a really important moment in his life. Where he's just rescued his nephew Lot. I don't know if you remember this. His nephew gets taken prisoner by these kings, and Abraham goes to war, and then he comes back, and he has this vision, and God kind of tells him, make a sacrifice for me to Abraham. And so Abraham takes a bunch of animals and he cuts them in two, and that's where the expression to cut a covenant comes from. Because they used to say you would cut a covenant. And so this is a way of sealing the deal with God. You would cut animals in two. And then, so Abraham in the Torah cuts up some animals into two, and the parts are divided into two. There's like a turtle dove, and there's a calf. And then somehow a deep darkness envelops him and goes into some kind of spiritual state. And that's when God talks to him and says, for the first time, I'm going to find you a descendant, even though you're like 90 plus years old or whatever, and your descendants are going to spend hundreds of years in Egypt, and that's it's a really important moment in his life. And it's kind of like a moment where God and Abraham's relationship is strengthened in their covenant. All those times we say, in our liturgy and other places, remember Abraham, and look kindly upon us because of Abraham's covenant with you. This is one of the 2 or 3 moments that are that covenant where God makes a covenant with Abraham. And it's and so it's this moment he has this deep vision, right? To their memory. So the Chassidim are interested in what was that vision? What was the nature of that vision? For peace. And what was it like? Because it's really mysterious. It says a deep darkness kind of enveloped Abraham. And then he kind of went, he was in dread. It says he was in dread of God. We're so what does that mean? I mean, if this is like such an important moment, but what's fascinating about old Jewish mystics of this kind is that they're using these moments to also talk about their own experience of encountering the divine, right? They're using this opportunity of talking about Abraham's vision to try and talk about, well, what is vision in general? They're not doing it from just analyzing text. They're talking about it from their own experience, because each one of us, when we're talking about religious experience, the only way we can relate to it is from our own religious experience. Like if you had a dream or had a sense in prayer, you were at musical Shabbat or some other time and you're really enjoying it, or, so we can only really relate to another person's spiritual experience from our own religious experience. If not, we're just making things up, right? We can say, oh, it's this, it's that, but if it's not coming from your own experience, how can you understand it? It's like if someone says, before America was discovered, right? I went to America, and someone starts to say, well, this is what America looks like. And others are like, well, I don't believe you. America can't look like this. It looks like this. Well, have you been there? No. Only if you've been there can you actually say what it actually looks like and feels like to be there, right? So, so this is kind of like what this is a little bit about. And we're going to go slowly. partly because I translated it, like I said myself, and it's got little rough bits. But also because I translated it, I want to give it its due.
The English,
What's that?
or Gahak the English.
Gehackte English, the hurried English. So, Alan, if your throat isn't
Sure,
good
I'll
enough,
give it a try. Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, Leflacha. Let us examine the meaning of the word
machazeh, machazeh.
machazeh, vision. Comes from Genesis 15:1. Sometime later, the word of God came to Abraham in a vision.
So actually, no, wait a second. I want to go get a Torah because I might read out those verses so we have them. I like that interesting. We know what the context is. I was talking about it, but to actually hear it in the Torah, I think it's more interesting, right? So it says, sometime later, the word of God came to Abraham in a vision. This is the verse he's about to drash on. He said, this is God, fear not, Abraham, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. But Abraham said, oh Lord God, what can you give me, seeing I shall die childless? And the one in charge of my household is the Meskek Eliezer, his servant, right? So Abraham says further, since you have granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir. The word of the Lord came to him in reply, thou one shall not be your heir, none but your very own issue shall be your heir. He took him outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars. If you are able to count them, he added, so shall your offspring be. And because he put his trust in the Lord, he reckoned it to his merit. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Hassidim to send his land to you as a possession. And he said, oh Lord, how shall I know that I am to possess it? He answered, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old she-goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young bird. He brought him all these and cut them in two, placing each half opposite the other, but he did not cut up the bird. Birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. As the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and a great dark dread descended upon him. And he, God, said to Abraham, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve. In the end they shall go free with great wealth. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a ripe old age. And they shall return here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And when the sun set and it was very dark, there appeared a smoking oven, and a flaming torch was passed between those pieces. So God cut the covenant himself, right? Passed through the covenant himself. And that day the Lord made a covenant for Abraham, saying, to your offspring I will assign this land, and so on. Powerful passage, right? Sometimes we don't always, there's a lot of beautiful passages that we don't read in depth because they're not at the beginning of the Parsha.
I
Go ahead.
don't know that I ever realized
Yes.
that God said to Abraham
Yeah.
about the 400 years.
Yeah.
It just took me by absolute surprise.
Yeah. Amazing, right? Well, this is
Why?
why what?
Why?
Why so many years? Why so many years? I mean, there's this big debate. Was it 200? Was it 400? But that's one of the biggest questions. Why did we have to go through the slavery in Egypt? That's a different topic, but it's a long time, right? It's a long time that they were in Egypt. It's a long time, and the fact that he told Abraham about it shows how, in our way we look at Judaism, how important it was to our story that this happened. It was already preordained, and so it makes everything else seem like everything was moving towards that, Okay.
When the prophets either saw or heard God's words, or the words God sent them from his greatness and grace, they would become completely detached from normal physical reality. Because they were detached from normal reality, they would be able to hear the words of the prophecy from the Holy Creator. When the prophet would transmit God's words to the people, they would still be detached from reality, their ordinary minds ceasing to function. How could their minds function while God was speaking to them, having delivered the message that God had instructed them to deliver? When they returned to themselves and to their own mind, their normal abilities would again begin to operate. After the prophet returned to normality, God's words would illumine from their higher mind to their lower mind.
A little dense, right? A little intense. So, what's it saying? So it's saying that, we read all about this throughout the whole Bible, the Tanakh, that God speaks to prophets, and so what was that like? You hear God's voice in your mind. Is it just like you're just the way you are now, and suddenly you hear God's voice and like, okay, well, I heard a voice in my head. Should I go on with my life, or do I talk about it to someone? I mean, what was that like? We read about it, and it's such an important part of our tradition, but what was it actually like?
Then you wouldn't hear anything else surrounding you.
Yeah,
It's just like,
it took you over, right? It was like a really intense. What does that mean to you to become completely detached from normal physical reality? What does that mean to you?
Zombie.
What does it mean to you that you would become completely detached from normal physical reality when they would hear God's prophecy?
Zombie state.
A zombie state. You're like, your hands are up and your eyes are all red.
But you don't have to be completely detached, obviously, right? You can be involved in that particular state and the normal state and
Well,
just being balanced properly.
Well, that's the whole topic. Well, he looks at it a little bit differently, but he says to really hear to really absorb that level of experience, even the prophets, they would just be taken into a whole thing. And then actually you see it when you read through the books of prophets, when God speaks to them, they're not just like, oh God, let me finish, tying my shoelace and then I'll hear your words, right? They're just suddenly transported into something else, right? It's like a completely enveloping experience to them, right? Ezekiel is like suddenly like, God, I'm but a moral, all of them. Whenever you read these experiences, it completely takes them over. They're in some completely other state. I mean, right? Isaiah's prophecy, right? Isaiah's in the temple and suddenly he sees God in front of him with God's robes coming into the prophet and angels singing, holy, holy, holy. And, it's like, if you're seeing that, I'm not sure you're noticing, the stain on your sleeve, or, it's completely, you're in somewhere else, right? This is like a.
But it also depends how often you've seen that. In fact, he makes this point. If you've seen that lots of times, it's not a big deal, right? And it is just part of what you happen to be seeing at the moment.
And it doesn't terrify you.
No,
So I think that it's part of it is that, but I think there's layers on it too. And let's keep going. I think it's
except that when the person came out of that state, what he had heard then goes into.
exactly beautiful. I think it's it. It's like when you're there, you're in something else. And he's also talking about the immensity of hearing God's voice. Like this is something like, and so he said, because they were detached from normal reality, they would be able to hear the words of the prophecy from the Holy Creator. So suddenly you're just like, go ahead, Barbara.
I don't think you can have detachment without being unified with something greater.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's not that you're gone and detached. It
Yes.
just dissolves some boundaries, and
yeah.
you are part of something that you don't even see boundaries in.
You're part of something much great. You're part of something much great. You're just taken into something else.
But not even thinking that you're taking it to
Yeah,
something.
yeah. It's not like you're making it happen. It's just happening to you. It's like suddenly it's like you're overshadowed by this by the Holy Creator, not this Holy Creator.
I think.
Yeah,
in
go ahead.
conjunction with that, I mean, you can't be unconscious or a zombie at that moment because.
It's the opposite. You're super conscious. You're super conscious. Yeah,
Because they're not your words that come from God.
exactly.
So,
I think that, and that's really good. It's not, you're not in a trance. You're not just like, bumbling from the mouth. You're super conscious. Your eyes you're 10 times as awake as you were before. And you're what people call super conscious, because you're having to filter through your little mind, the mind of God. I mean, imagine God's mind, right? That's has all knowledge, everything. So suddenly there's a bridge created and you're having to be taken into understanding something of that magnitude. And so, so they're ordering him. So when the prophet would transmit God's words to the people, they would still be. So you to be able to hold that, and also, why is it that when the prophet spoke, people would listen? I mean, if me or Vladimir suddenly went into the town square of Oak Park and said, "God says," nobody's going to listen to us.
Hallelujah.
Right? Nobody's going to listen to us because we're not carrying with us the power of that super conscious state. So they're saying is that when the prophet would go and speak to the people, they were still in that state of mind, and the people would feel some of it, and that it had a power to it and a enlightened quality to it. The people, when they heard it, not everyone, if people were totally not resonating, but people who had some feeling for it would suddenly feel it, and that would take them into something, and then it would be a moment, right? And when you read the books of prophets, I wish maybe we'll do this a little bit later today or some other time. I just want to finish. You would hear there's the prophet suddenly speaks, in front of like the court of the king, and everybody stops in their tracks, even all the evil prophets, even all the things. I mean, it's something resounding, it's got power to it. And it's not like just, hey, listen to me, I'm here, I'm a prophet, there's something that's happening. And so I think so their ordinary mind isn't when they're in that and they're just in that space, they receive the divine prophecy, and then they're going out and they're transmitting it to other people. It's something. Well, Vladimir.
Yeah, so speaking concretely,
Yes.
when you have a deaf person like all of us have thoughts in his mind,
Yes.
they think all the time
Yes.
with different thoughts which are coming and go away. But when we talk about the God speaking with people, we tell that he speaks with which
full voice.
like a schizophrenic says. They say they hear voices, or if there's or this is a mental perception of something which is going on. And
So my impression is not like you hear. I don't know. I think it's you hear something, but straight away it's God talking. If it's coming from God, and this is from my understanding and is that when it really is God, and that really God, and now we're getting into all kinds of esoteric, but people say I heard spirits or this, but if God is talking to you, you're blown away. And when people hear you, they don't think you're crazy, they can feel you're for real. And I'll get one last thing I would say. The Baal Shem Tov describes what is it like to hear God's voice. You're speaking about deaf. It's like if, let's say you were deaf, and you go into a room and everybody in that room is hearing the most exquisite music. This is the parable that the Baal Shem Tov uses. And they're like going like this, wow, this is the most beautiful music I've ever heard. What does a deaf person think? These people are meshugana because they can't hear the music, right? So that's what it's like to hear God's voice. And if you can't hear it, then you're the deaf person, right? You're like, these people are meshuga because look at them, they're in this thing. But if you're hearing the voice, if you're hearing that exquisite music, if you're hearing God's voice and it's affecting you in such a powerful way. So people on LSD thought that too, so.
that's exactly.
Do you
what
think-
he said.
Go ahead.
Do you think that people that heard the Baal Shem Tov or Rebbe Nachman,
Yeah.
they hear them as prophet like that?
The people hear them or that they heard God?
Well, I'm just saying, when a prophet comes to the people, they
Yeah.
respond to the prophet because that prophet is emanating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Did the Baal
exactly.
Shem
I think
Tov
that's,
emanate that? Did the
he did.
Rebbe
Yeah, I
emanate
think they did. I mean, people talk about even the Chabad Rebbe, right? The Chabad Rebbe, people talk about being in this. I mean, why were there millions of people who were, felt drawn to him or went to get his dollar or, they felt, and then you see it in the room when he's pounding his fist, singing his songs. The whole room is like trunk on the power that's kind,
That's the Dalai Lama.
yeah, I think so.
Remember last year I spoke about the client I had for quite a while.
Yeah.
And she insisted, and she didn't appear to be a crazy woman, she appeared to be a normal wife, mother, working lady. in her dreams, she believed that God spoke to her. She wrote
Yeah.
a book about it, so.
Yeah,
How can I tell her that she
No,
didn't? If she
no.
thinks she did,
there's,
because he would tell her different things that she followed.
so I'll tell you, I was once at a Shabbat dinner in Jerusalem, and there were a number of people at the Shabbat dinner. And at the end, beginning, everybody's talking about whatever. At the end, the host said, I want to ask everybody about your religious experiences. I'm like, interesting, okay. And there were a few people there who I would have never expected, kind of like spoke about hearing God's voice, and the hearing God's voice changed their life forever. Like it was a shift that made them go from something that was not for them towards something that was good for them, or they just changed their life for the better. And it's not like something they talk about every day, but here there was this prompt. And so there's a surprising amount of people who will have, a few spiritual experiences in their life like this that will transform their lives, and really redirect them in one way or the other. And I think, this is something like that, but it's in a very, very intense way, because I think when God is giving you a message for your own life, it's different when God is saying, here is a message to give to the people, and that comes from a very high, powerful place. And so anyway, how could their minds function while God was speaking to them, right? It's like, your mind is like, having delivered the message God instructed them, when they return to themselves and to their own mind, then suddenly you start to feel your normal abilities. And then there wasn't this process of integration, they would say, right? Where their normal mind would be like, start to integrate, wow, I had this experience, I received them, what does it mean? What does it mean in the context of my life? I guess when it was happening, they weren't thinking, amazing, I'm having this experience, right? You never read that Isaiah says, amazing, I'm having this experience. This is so cool. He doesn't say that. He's like, oh gosh, God, why I'm unworthy, right? You're just in the moment of the experience, right? That's what it is every time when there's one of the things that happen. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Because as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about Jeremiah.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, there are obviously circumstances where he's not necessarily transported, like, and I forget the king's name, the king that came to him and wanted to know what was going to happen in the back.
Right.
That
Yeah.
sort of thing. And he came to in secret. And yet he's still, speaking God's word.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, and I think his experience, even though it's juxtaposed, supports everything you're saying, because
Yeah.
he said, I don't want to speak these words because everybody hates me.
Yeah.
With the stuff that I'm saying, but I'm compelled
I
to say
can't
these
stop.
words.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway.
He suffered greatly. Well, we'll get to that, because I think it's actually exactly what we're about to get to. And, to Jeremiah had the worst job, right? Because he was supposed to tell everybody in Jerusalem, God is going to destroy Jerusalem. You think God's going to save Jerusalem? God's not going to. So nobody likes the guy who's saying, you're all sinners, you're all bad, right? That's the worst prophetic job. And he was put in prison, right? The king put him in prison, and he had a really hard few years, but he was overcome with these things at different moments, and speaking, and God indicating to him through his life,
But in support of everything you
Yeah,
said too,
yeah.
people listened. They didn't question whether what he was saying was coming from God. It made them angry,
Yeah.
but they didn't question it. They knew it's the power.
He was a personality. There was
Voice of God.
something. He was an important character and personality, and that's why they put him in jail, because the king was said to him, how could you be telling this to the people? This is not a. So, let's.
I want to say something about there was a distinction that was sort of important between the philosophical approach to this same experience and the pious approach to this experience. The pious approach to the experience that you're talking to was classically one where you got on your knees and you asked God what you can do for him. Okay, how I can be better, etc. It had a moral dimension, and it had a master-slave relationship. The philosophic approach was you said, wow, what was that? What was that? And how might I get more of it?
Yeah.
And those two are, those two were very interesting perspectives on the same.
My take is I think basically the philosophers did not achieve what the prophets achieved. I think they were achieving a different kind of state, but I think that maybe there were very, very few philosophers, but I don't think they were. I think that I think that's part of the whole basis of this, which I think to actually, let's read what he says about Moses, but I think the magnitude of this experience, you can get, or but which we're about to read, you can get to a place where it's normative, but that's like 5 people in the whole world ever could achieve that at one time. It's like so unbelievably rare because it's way beyond mind. Even the state that he's talking about is way beyond mind. So if you're conserving mind in any way, then you're not that place. This is the transcendent state that's beyond all mind, right? In the East, in Hinduism, they call that state nirvikalpa samadhi. And they say when you achieve that state, if you don't come out of it, you die immediately. You just go on to the next world because you completely detach from your body. You're just your spirit is completely somewhere else. But there's a state that's even higher than that, but that's even more. So I think this is what we're actually talking about. So, Morris, if you don't mind reading the next paragraph.
I mentioned one thing, just
Go ahead, Laurel. Go ahead.
just at the beginning, it says when the prophets either saw or heard God's words, they would become completely detached. Because they were detached from normal reality, then they would be able to hear the words. And so it's like they were already in a state of mind, maybe to allow it to happen in the first place. A little bit like what we were talking about with Rabbi Nachman.
Yeah, I think they didn't go from 0 to 100. They were already at 50, and then they were taken to 100. But I think if you were to really go from 0 to 100, you would explode probably, or something. For lack of a better way of talking about it. But yeah, I think it was like it was like the extra level. They were living at 50, and suddenly God took them to 5th gear, and suddenly from that place there was a melding of minds to take in that actual prophetic words.
So what you're saying too is to go slow, right? You're saying that the development of this ability to be in a position where you could experience what they're talking about is a slow development. And in fact, you want it to be sort of slow. You don't want it to be abrupt. So
I think it's slow, but it's also that when God comes down to you. I mean, this is what they say in the Eastern way of looking at this, which I think is what he's saying too, is that you can go on and you can receive God's words, but they're not God's words. Only God, like this is only God chooses you. At this level is only something that God can make happen. That level of super consciousness, you can't achieve. It can only really come from grace. And not everybody's meant to have it, and that's the most powerful, highest. But when you do it, then you're completely out in a way that's completely beyond. Go ahead, Barbara.
I mean, I was thinking the same thing. It's not a will thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to translate.
Yes, yeah.
Is when it says completely detached, it does imply it's
Yeah.
going from here to here.
Yeah,
Maybe
Yeah.
it's taken on a journey towards detachment and then
yeah.
there's a continuum, not willed, but
Yeah, the completely detached is, I mean, there's, now we're getting to meditative, and I think there's many different, even in the lower kind of vision of this, you can still be completely detached from physical reality. And then there's what they're talking about, which is even way, way beyond that. But this is, I mean, this is what they talk about when people go through states like this, is that you look at the person and you're like, it looks like they're dead. Like they have no pulse. They were literally scientists who will kind of examine a person who's in this state and there's no pulse. There's no life in them, and then comes back. Like literally their body. And this is where you have all these things, which I take with a little bit of a grain of salt, but I'm not good. Where they say that people can go into this state for a long, long time, and their bodies, they don't need food, they don't need almost anything because there's no life in it. So, but it's literally like you could, it's very hard to bring someone back from this kind of states. But
these states are subjective, right? I mean, and they're completely personal, and they're completely subjective, but in being completely subjective to yourself, they're objectively subjective.
Well, the,
So,
think the
so,
state-
but
the
they
state
are,
of it-
so there's going to be lots of differences among people in in this whole thing. I mean, if you're on the path for looking for this stuff, you're not going to have exactly the same experience as somebody else, but it'll be close. It'll be somewhat close.
well, I think that there's in the big experiences, there's certain elements that are pretty objective. And they say this in the East, if you're the highest of them, if you're in it for 30 days and you're gone, your soul just leaves your body. There's some they're objective because they affect the physical body and the physical mind in a way that's to the intensity, it's no longer like you're having a kind of an experience that's we can all relate to. It's something beyond that. Go ahead.
I know this isn't.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I know speaking in tongues isn't the same as this, how is?
I
it
don't.
different?
That's what I'm trying to get at. That's why I'm spending so much time on it. I think speaking in tongues is without getting too judgmental, is a much lower variety of spiritual experience. And I think that's why this is so important, because one can think like, it's just like speaking in tongues, you just go to church and everybody said, no, that's a much lower. That's like going in a trance. This is a super conscious state, and it's really important to tell the difference, because speaking in tongues is not the same as a prophet of the Bible who's receiving God's direct word. Because with that person who's speaking in tongues, this is at least the person who's speaking in tongues, whatever they say, even if you were to write it down, the next day nobody's going to care about it because it doesn't come with that power. But we still read those words, and you read the prophecies. They're amazing. I mean, they have such power to them, right? They transport you. There's something that's beyond anything. And so I remember once I was in an interfaith meeting, and we were talking about stuff like this, and someone was saying, again, I'm trying not to be judgmental. He was saying, and it was interfaith. He was in my church. We channel, Moses, and we channel Buddha, we channel Krishna, we channel all these, and he was talking about it so like normatively. I'm like, I mean, even if one of those were real, you wouldn't be saying it just like in so little respect and you would be saying each one of those, if it was real would blow your mind, And
You'd
so I
have
think
more awe.
they would have a lot more awe, And so I think there's a lot of things that happen within the psychic realm, which is much lower than coming to the divine realm. And this is what all of this talks about. There's a difference between the psychic realm, and there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of psychics, and they can contact the psychic realm, but it's not the same as the divine realm. The divine realm comes with a power, and like we said, the Bible is still around 3,500 years later because it comes from that place, right? It's got a power to it. And I think that's why one of the reasons I think religion is still important, because it helps us differentiate between those, it helps protect us. And that's the difference between, going, when I was in LA, every street has its psychic, right? Because there's so many of them, you go to them and it's like, and so what's the difference between Moses and the psychic? Well, there's a difference. The psychic is something, it is, I think, Moses, it takes moral, ethical, tremendous strife and trial and tribulations and working on self and God's grace. And it's a process that goes, you read about it, you read even Abraham's life, that process he goes to achieve what he achieves is incredible, trials and tribulations and sufferings and God's continued visitation and leading him on and training him. And, and finally at the end of all of those, and we have what's recorded, but how much is not recorded at the end of his life comes to that. So that's the kind of rarity of that kind of life to get to that. It's not just like, so it doesn't mean the other isn't useful, doesn't have a place too, but it's important to have, I think, discrimination and understanding.
Well, I was thinking about Balak.
Yeah. Balak, yeah, right.
This guy talked to him
Yeah.
well, not
Yeah.
in a way, but
Yeah.
he, he's certainly not
He's not Moses or an Abraham. Was a spiritual person.
Yeah,
Obviously, I mean, other people, other kings went to him for
yeah,
advice.
yeah,
But God said, no, you can't do that, So
yeah. And then, and it's such an interesting story, that story around Bilam and Balak, right? So Bilam is the prophet and Balak is the king, right? One always gets confused, but so Bilam goes, but Bilam is spiritual enough that when God actually speaks to him, he recognizes it and he's like, I can't do what you're telling me to do because God has actually come to me and I'm not gonna mess with that because this is something at a whole other level, right? So, and he refuses to do the king's job, right? Because he's being taken over by the actual thing, and it's like really whole other level.
I'd just like to.
Diane, go ahead. Yeah.
So, I've had an extremely long spiritual journey, and I'm not gonna track what I'm gonna say. I'll provide any other details if anybody's curious.
Yeah.
Behind what I'm gonna say, but what I will say, I have been to these congregations where they speak in tongues and prophesy and all that other sort of stuff, and I will say that my analysis is that the goal of all of that is an emotional experience. They tie emotionality
Yes,
to
yes,
spirituality. And that's not necessarily the case. Spirituality is not necessarily emotionality. And that includes, and the prophesying that Christian groups talk about is I'm making myself a prophet or prophetess rather than it being, and I mean, that's not their intention, don't get me wrong, but that my analysis is that's the net result of it all. And so it's very different. And yes, there is a certain level of disrespect because there's a lack of understanding about the Tanakh. The very few Christians know anything about the Tanakh. It's mostly the Greek scriptures, so they kind of like pull bits and pieces and don't get it.
so I
Anyway,
think
that's
it's
my
every, thank you so
and
much.
just a disclaimer
think-
for anybody who's
No.
listening to this tape afterwards.
Yes.
I am a Christian. I am speaking from authority, so there you go.
Thank you. Well, I think every religion has that. So I don't want to say every religion has, and the intention might be good, but I think we said it's really interesting from emotion because in kind of the science of spirituality, you say that to get to those psychic states, often emotion is used. Because you can work up your emotions, and you even see, in some cultures, the drum beats and bum, 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 you kind of get into a whole thing, and that helps you go into that psychic state. But that's different than like a real, look, not all of us are prophets, not all of us can be a Jeremiah or an Isaiah, but we all can. For some people, that's helpful to go in the other. The other is a much more difficult and long journey, but maybe that, in my mind, it's the more powerful, truer one, but it's asking a lot for everybody to be a Moses, but if you can help people, but there's ways to bridge these different ways, and one of the emotions that is very positive is a sense of devotion. If you feel a feeling of devotion and love for God, that's an emotion that can help bridge you into experience, because we all need, if you have no spiritual experience, everybody has some spiritual experience, because if not, you wouldn't be coming to this building at all, right? You wouldn't be praying, every time you prayed, you didn't feel a little bit of some juice flowing, you wouldn't want to pray at all. You'd be like, what am I doing? So everybody who prays feels a little bit of something.
And if you don't have any spiritual experience, you become seriously depressed, by the way. If there's no spiritual experience, you don't have to be conscious of it being spiritual experience. It just can feel like life. It can feel like being alive. So it doesn't announce itself all the time as a spiritual experience.
Yeah, if you have no spirit in your life, then life is going to feel very flat. And you don't. There are some people who are flowing with spirit, and they might not even know it or think about it, but they just are, and that's just and they might be, at least again my feeling, they might be because of the wonderful moral and ethical way they live. They might be living spiritually in a more refined way than some people who might be totally immersed in spirit, but because they haven't done that other work are in that place. And so it's very complicated, but I think it's really interesting. So should we try reading? Go ahead.
Very subjective.
On some level, it has to be subjective.
I am a Napoleon.
What's that?
I can imagine myself that I'm a Napoleon, but I'm not Napoleon. It is all exactly what it is. Either we believe in this or not. It can be as much with the same degree of veracity, deny it or not.
Well, it's not something that, at this point in time, at least you can verify empirically. You can only verify it the way you verify other things in one's life, which is, you love your spouse. There's no machine that's going to be able to measure your love for your spouse. The only thing you measure it is you talk to other people who also love their spouse.
But it's not a religious experience.
It's not, but it's another thing in life that you can't measure. But that you could, but that's one of the most important things in your life, right? Your love for your spouse is something you can't measure, but it's one of the most important things in your life. So religious experience, you can't measure, but can be one of the most important.
Spouse and then you divorce.
Yeah, well, I hope not.
The experiences you're talking about are not sensory, okay? A religious experience isn't sensory. It isn't a sensory experience. It can be thought of a little bit like a sensory thing, but it comes from a different place than the sensations come from. So it doesn't have the verification issue that sensory things are available to empirical verification. This is coming from a place which is not sensory.
So the one place where, so I had this conversation law with the dean of my rabbinical school, Rabbi Brad Artson. We had this big disagreement because he said science will never be able to understand that because it's in the realm of metaphysics. He called it music, metaphysics, meditation beyond the realm of physics. And I said, I think it's possible that one day science will be able to. And there are some experiments, right, where they can feel the magnetic radiation coming from a person's heart, for example, and it affects different things. It can affect people. I mean, there's things that people are starting to discover. And so my general thing is never say science has finished its journey of discovering what people experience. And I compare it to, for example, hundreds of years ago, human beings looked at clouds going through the sky and thought there's no way they will understand what all this is, but people discovered it, right? And they understood what those clouds are. And so I think it is possible that the science will come to understand that part too, just as we understand and come to, and so what I think what's really useful about what Levi Yitzchak is bringing and others who are at this very lofty level of understanding this is that that realm science does not understand at this moment. So the only way we can understand it is through those who have gone far enough in the journey that they can speak about it. And it's very hard to find people who've gone that far who will speak as clearly as he is here about it. And so, we can read the Tanakh and read about it, but they're not telling us exactly what they're going through. We can kind of read it and surmise, and we can read of other traditions too, if that's something that we do. But in Judaism, the Kabbalists talk about it, but they talk about it in such complicated ways that it's very hard to understand. But this, I think, reading about this can be intriguing and also illuminating about where we are, where one's own self is, and how one can, aspire for more, and a path that feels protected and real, and that can take us forward. So,
Mr.
let me read. Go ahead, Morris. Go ahead. We're going to read this.
Procedure
Yeah.
just described applied to all prophets throughout the ages, with the exception of Moses, who, as he spoke the words of the Holy One, was in the same mind as when he approved them. Because Moses, our rabbi, was always separated from his wife, and he was always in the state of mind that the other prophets were in, when they were detached from their physical reality.
This is tucked in here is one of the most unusual statements you'll ever hear in the Jewish text. And we're going to have to talk about this more next time because we're coming to the end.
He had children.
He had children.
He was separated from his wife.
It says,
For most, he had 2 children, but then the rest of the time he was in Egypt.
It was artificial.
he was in Egypt and then he was doing his other things. No, there are different periods to his life, right? Different periods to his life. But So-
It's always in the higher mind.
Exactly. So what they're saying, but this is from my understanding of this is that the highest, there's that place where you go into that super conscious state where you're actually encountering God, which is extraordinarily rare, which is a combination of a whole spiritual life of many years of much strife and work and all these things. But there's a state which is above that, which is even more exceedingly rare. Very few people ever can even be on to achieve it. But he's saying Moses is where you can then come down and integrate it. That your lower mind and your higher mind become fused. And you could just then kind of live a normal, natural life, but at the same time be connected to the mind of the whole universe. And that is something that's just mind-blowing to even think about it, that you could receive God's direct communication, in that, in the very moment.
But be celibate?
Yeah.
What?
But be
So I
celibate.
think what he's saying is that to achieve that, maybe the physicality of intimacy, you can't be at that highest level if you're engaging regularly in the
I've heard that
intimacy.
from
Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, that's what Nachman said too.
Yeah, that's
He
what Rebbe Nachman said
It's the
too.
same
So,
thing. It's the same thing. Yeah,
And
and
they-
that particular, it's almost like there's a conservation of energy at that particular level. The energy either gets dissipated below the waist or it gets sort of
It's raised,
raised
yeah.
up into a higher realm.
Well,
And
maybe
that-
maybe it's a conservation of the creative energy. So
It is.
Maybe.
Exactly,
yeah.
that's exactly it. That's the way the Easterns talk about it. It's the creative energy has to be raised and not, but what I will say from what he's saying and from other Hasidic texts is that it doesn't mean that Moses went through periods in his life, there were different periods for different things, right? There were a period in his life where he did get married and he had kids and he had his whole thing, and then he had this unbelievable task that was put upon him where he had to, bring the Torah and bring God's word to the people, and to be in that state, it wasn't very nice maybe to his wife, but he had to kind of, and it wasn't the only thing he had to do, right? He had to be with the people all the time because they were constantly turning to him for advice and for inspiration, and he basically gave over the last 40 years of his life to being God's direct messenger. And you see that it wasn't always easy for him. He's, every now and then he explodes and this is so difficult. Why me, God, right? And God stopped us, and
We see that with the confessions in St. Augustine.
yeah. Yeah.
You're the happiest person in the world if you believe like this.
Well,
I have a lot of doubts.
So we don't have to feel that you have to finish a page, there's a lot of stuff we can spread
it's
it.
good. It's good, right? We'll
Well, sometimes we feel like we gotta read everything, so maybe
Yeah.
we'll just do more next week.
we'll do more of it next week. Good.
And the week after, and the week after.
I'm glad all my pains translating it got, maybe I'll go back and send another copy, and some bits I wanna, honestly, when Levi Yitzchak is saying is really hard to translate sometimes and to understand, and have to really have a feeling for the meditative life to, exactly.
Yeah, it's a great work to translate this kind of stuff for sure, absolutely.
And you have to,
And that's wonderful.
So to read his stuff, and some of it, and there's some stuff later where I'm not 100% sure I know exactly what he was talking about, and I know when I saw what the translator put into it, I know it's not that, but I think he got, and some of it he just didn't translate it because it was too challenging, and some of it he tried to understand, and I think he understands it more through other kinds of lens, but I'm really pretty sure that but it's all, this is,
Listen, Rabbi, with this translation, I think you've introduced us all to level 2 of Prophet School 2025. This sort of reminds me of the Prophet School that some of us went to
Oh,
when we
really?
were youngsters.
Yeah, really.
When you
I mean,
said how important it is to hear the words of people who've gone through it, I really appreciate you translating to try to get us there, because it shows me that
Yeah.
we weren't gonna get there with the translation we
Yeah.
saw.
Thank
And
you.
that's how
Yeah.
important that is. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Well, that was exactly it. I felt we've had to really twist those words around to make it, and so this, I feel, opens it up more. So we'll try go a little bit more next week.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks an awful lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Okay.
all.
Very
Thank
thought provoking.
Hi.